Hello, underground artist again, Sandez Rey. You know, I'm going to take these glasses off for these videos because the truth is I take them on and off all the time, and I'd like to have a consistent look that's either glasses all the way on all the time or all the way off. And the fact is that when I'm writing, drawing, reading something, doing anything up close, I take them off. So it's not because I'm vain, or it's not at least the primary reason. It's just that if in the course of these videos I may want to read you something or draw you something or write something on a whiteboard, so I just as soon have them off. What I want to avoid is looking over them like this all the time, like a grandpa. I'm an old man, but I'm not a grandpa yet. So this is just one of many stories about the past that I'd like to tell for no particular reason. I think people find stories interesting. When I was a teenager, I was very bad. I had a bad attitude. In a different video, I'll get into the whole thing about being child labor, growing up poor in the suburbs, and the hidden poor, and being child labor at the age of 12, coming from a broken home, and having no father in the home, and a mom who was working 7 days a week, and me and my big sister raising my two little brothers, and things like that gave me a bad attitude. Working summers, laying sod from the age of 12 on gave me a bad attitude. I had money in my pocket in the wintertime, and I was around adults in the summertime, and I thought I was really grown up. And at the age of 15, by the age of 15, I was primed and ready to become a total juvenile delinquent, which I pretty much promptly did. Discovered marijuana and discovered hard drugs and alcohol. Started hanging out in bars before they started being serious about carding people. Discovered which bars weren't carding people, and that's all stories I can tell in a different video. But I want to get right into my career as a juvenile delinquent with my best buddy, who I'm going to call Dillinger, Tom Dillinger. It's not his real name, but I'm going to have to change the names in some of these stories. And of course the fact is that a lot of the really great stories I can't ever tell, no matter how much I change the names. I am a deep well of secrets, mostly other people's secrets, and I don't want to give away anybody else's secrets. It just happens that my old best friend and partner in crime, we used to sell weed together and committed countless acts of villainy together, and we were true amigos, true blood brothers. It just so happens that he passed away, died tragically young. Everyone who knew him thought he would die in a car accident because he was a total leadfoot, or in some misunderstanding with the police, because even though he was a very peaceful and gentle and kind, loving soul, he did carry a loaded gun around. That was just part of his personality. So everyone thought he would go an unnatural way, but Dillinger didn't go an unnatural way. He moved to Florida, became an exterminator, and got some weird exotic cancer, which they said was a 1,000,000 to 1 shot, and died, I want to say, in his early 40s. You know, died. I'm 56. He died, oh gosh, 15 years ago, something like that, in that neighborhood. The doctor told him that the cancer was nothing to do with, I'm going to turn on my timer because this video recorder separates videos at the 33-minute mark, so I want to make sure I stay well underneath that, so I turned on a little clock timer here that I can periodically check. Doctor told Dillinger that the cancer wasn't due to all of his drugs and alcohol use. Both of us kind of disbelieved that because we'd both indulged so heavily. But one thing's for sure is that he had a possibility of surviving it if they could have given him chemotherapy. Unfortunately, they can't give you chemotherapy if you've been pounding down the alcohol for 30-some years. And good old Dillinger had a very damaged liver by the time he contracted this cancer, and the doctor told him that if we try to give you chemo, your liver is just going to shut down and you're just going to die. So they couldn't give him chemo, and so I guess you could say indirectly the drinking probably killed him, which, you know, had he continued living, the drinking probably would have killed him eventually, because he was kind of an alkie, but weren't we all? you know. Maybe we all weren't, but I was. Well, I was never an alcoholic. Drinking was never my main problem. I was much more of a druggie. I'm still a drinking man to this day. I'm not an alcoholic, but I do enjoy a drink. And that's always been the way I am. It's just, isn't drinking, I am an obsessive compulsive person, but drinking is not ever been my main problem. My problem has always been the weed. And back when I was a teenager in the 70s, I was very much into LSD, which I think it's a bum rap. I think it's a great drug, even though I don't do it anymore. It definitely gets a bum rap. But, so anyways, the doctors told Dillinger towards the end that he could try some exotic experimental treatments that they thought would have a, gazillion to one chance of helping him, and sure as hell they didn't help him. And so he passed away young, tragically. So the fact that he's dead as a doornail means that I can tell some stories about us without having to worry about any repercussions blowing back on him, and I won't use his real name. I think he'd like the name of Dillinger. He was a great shot with a gun. He enjoyed carrying a gun. He had a police marksman's badge because he was in the junior cadet or something police marksmanship program when he was a youth. He was a child of a broken home just like me. His parents had a horrible divorce, and he had running battles with his mother from day one. His mom was legendary for her ability to not get along with people. I personally was kicked out of his house almost constantly as a teenager because his mom thought that I was a bad influence on him, which is hilarious because he was actually much more of a bad influence on me in a lot of ways than I was on him. Although I do think there was a lot of back and forth and we did influence each other. It wasn't definitely a negative juvenile delinquent thing that we got into when we got together. But we had a lot of fun, a boatload of fun. And I basically, just a little of my history, I basically stayed high between the age of 15 and I would say 29, pretty much every day. And no, not 29, I would say 27, about a dozen years. And then I quit completely and stopped smoking weed for a good dozen years, didn't smoke it at all. And then I went back to smoking it and, smoked it pretty heavily for a while. I got married in '89 to my wife, Raquel, and make some videos about that sometime, talking about racial issues since we are a biracial couple. I'm white, she's black, and we have 2 children who are mixed, beautifully mixed. They're both way better looking than either one of us. Somehow the combination really worked for them. But yeah, after I married my wife, I quit using for about 12 years, and then we were having a rough patch in our marriage, I believe, and went back to it and got kind of back into it a little bit heavily for a while, just not the LSD, but just the smoking, and then it backed off that again, and I won't say I'm absolutely quit today, because if I'm with an old friend and they have something to smoke, I am going to be totally down to smoke with them, but I don't buy it. I don't have any in my house, so it's more of a circumstantial thing. And because I know so many people, sometimes when I get to, and because I got so many people high out of my stash back in the old days, when I do get together with old friends, there is this vibe where people who have something kind of want to get me high. So that's kind of nice. I got, as Bill Murray said in Caddyshack, I got that going for me. But I don't buy it anymore. I don't have it in my house, and I try to set a relatively good example for my kids. Meh, I'm going to give that meh an exclamation point. Meh! But, So anyways, flag stealing and LSD story. So back when we were juvenile delinquents, and this is in high school, it might have been 15 or 16, me and Dillinger got on this kick of stealing people's American flags. And I don't know why. It's kind of hard to explain when you look back on it, because you had to kind of be there in the 70s. In the 70s there was a lot of holdover from the 60s, where there was a lot of like hard left, like hippieism that was just permeating the youth culture, and along with that went a sort of anti-Americanism, where you sort of like being anti-authority, you were just kind of anti the whole, John Wayne, America's great narrative, which, and I love John Wayne movies, by the way. I love all the old classic movies, and I could do a whole video about which John Wayne movies I love the most, and I even like the Green Berets, so I'm not anti-John Wayne, so don't put that on me. But yeah, I guess there was a little tinge of anti-Americanism to it. It was mostly a rebellion against authority, a rebellion against the suburbs. The suburb that I actually lived in was a very poor suburb. It was on what I would call the near north side of Minneapolis, because it was very close to the Minneapolis city limits on the north side. If you went down to the movie theater that was closest to my house, where I saw most of my movies that I didn't see in the drive-in, I saw at this Terrace Theater. If you went down there and just continued past it just a little ways, there was the Minneapolis city limits, and there was the Triangle Liquor Store and Broadway, which was a big drag through one of the not so great neighborhoods in North Minneapolis. And North Minneapolis has a bad reputation. It's still a lot better than like any bad neighborhood in Chicago, I would say. And I've lived in North Minneapolis before when it was at its bad peak, I would say. But I'm a big fan of Minneapolis, so I'm not going to say too many bad things about it. But where I grew up was in a very blue-collar or lower blue-collar suburb, if you can picture this, right across the line from North Minneapolis. And it was called Crystal, and it was sort of a juncture where different suburbs came together. Within walking, if you would walk a half hour in one direction, you would be in North Minneapolis. If you would walk, I would say, a half hour in a different direction, you'd be in the suburb of Golden Valley. If you would alter your direction to go this way, excuse me, I have water handy, you would be in the suburb of New Hope. And if you would just alter your direction to go up a different way, so it's like this way, North Minneapolis, Golden Valley, New Hope, and straight back that way was Plymouth. My high school, which was walking distance from my house, was actually in a corner of Plymouth. So what I was actually living in was in this little boot-shaped wedge of Crystal that stuck down right up to North Minneapolis, and where all these different suburbs butted together. And Dillinger's house was close walking distance to my house, and he actually lived in New Hope. So these are all these suburbs are basically working class suburbs. But where I lived, when I was a kid, there's a main drag street called Winnetka, and on the other side of that street was literally a swamp. It was a swamp. I mean, it was about 12 square blocks of swamp, undeveloped land, and it was low and marshy, and it was a swamp. And but it's Minnesota, so you don't have any alligators or pythons in it. On the other side of Winnetka is where my street was. And 2 blocks from my house, 2.5 blocks from my house, was my elementary school. Walking to my elementary school, once you got off my block into the next block was mostly vacant lots, because the area when I was a kid was under development. So the development in that area was still very sparse. I lived at, well, probably shouldn't tell you exactly where I lived, because my mom still lives there, but I lived close to Winnetka and close to Sonneson Elementary School, which was the school I went to. But beyond that, if I can describe this suburb to you, how low class and cheap was this suburb, let me tell you. There was only one house on our block that had a second story. All the rest of the houses, or anywhere in our neighborhood, all the rest of the houses were single-story, 3-bedroom houses with unfinished basements, all shaped like shoe boxes, more or less. Just a straight little box. None of these houses had a paved driveway. They all came with gravel driveways, and nobody could really afford to pave their driveways. People started paving their driveways in the late 60s, the early 70s. We were like the last, because my parents broke up and got divorced, and our finances, which were already horrible, went completely off the cliff. we were like the last family to pave the driveway. They put in an ordinance at one point saying that you couldn't build a new house in that neighborhood and have an unpaved driveway, but all the old houses got grandfathered in and didn't have to change them. So we had mostly dirt because the rocks had been, the gravel that was on it had been pushed down into the dirt a long time ago. And so unpaved driveways, no second stories, nobody had a garage. Nobody had an attached garage, nobody had an unattached garage. Okay, so if you can picture this, these houses were all built without garages. They were built absolutely as cheap as you could build them. And my parents' house actually only cost, I believe, around $30,000. And they moved into it in, I was born in 1960, they moved into it in 62 or 63. So yeah, and the house payment on that house was like $150 a month. That's all it was. And yet, still, we had a real hard time making that in the 60s. Our house went into foreclosure 3 times when I was a kid, and my dad, through his talent for bullshitting people, was able to pull it out of foreclosure by the skin of his teeth all 3 times. After my parents were divorced, my mom worked 7 days a week. She worked 5 days a week at a car dealership answering phones, and then on the weekends she worked at the Radisson Hotel on the front desk. And she worked 7 days a week for 5 years straight without taking off a day. And that's why it didn't go into foreclosure after my parents were divorced, despite the payment only being $150, mind you. Of course, money was worth more then. But so that was where I grew up, in this low-rent, blue-collar suburb, but it was a suburb. And stealing flags, getting back to stealing flags. So when I was about 16, me and Dillinger started stealing American flags among the many other juvenile delinquent things that we would do. We were stealing flags, and we stole a couple flags and thought it was a hoot. And then I made things worse because I was down by Golden Valley, which was just down the road from my house, and there was the Golden Valley Police Station there, and the Golden Valley Fire Station there, and they're both open all night. But the police station was kind of funny because it didn't actually have really any windows facing the front. You had to go in through a double door, through another door to get into the front room of the police station. I was never in there. And being, in the suburbs, there wasn't a lot of activity at the police station at night. I mean, on Friday and Saturday night they might haul in a drunk, and they might, go tell some teenagers to turn down the music, or something like that, or bust somebody for smoking a joint. But, there wasn't a lot of crime out there. There was vandalism. Me and Dillinger were doing that. But there wasn't a lot of crime. People sold marijuana. Me and Dillinger did that. But there wasn't a lot of crime besides that. Actually, there wasn't a lot of crime that we weren't actually responsible for. Now that I think about it, we were like, if they had busted us, they would have resolved a lot of the crime issues around there. But so anyways, this police station did not have windows in the front, but they did have a flagpole out there with a flag on it. So I thought, I'm going to steal the flag from the police station, because we've already stolen some flags, and that just seems like a thing that's a challenge. So what I did was I tried to get it down, but I couldn't get it down because it had one of those things that is like way up high, and you need like a rod to like unhook the cord that you run it down on, because the thing is too high for you to reach, and you can't climb the flagpole. It's just not right for climbing. So I'm very tall, I'm 6'4", so I was able to jump up and get a hold of the string, but I wasn't, the cord that held the flag up, but I wasn't able to untie it, which was frustrating. So the second or third time I jumped up there, I just jumped up and grabbed the cord with both hands and planted both feet on the flagpole and leaned back with my entire skinny, like 169, 170 pound weight, just leaned back, leaned into it blatantly. Now if a police car had pulled up at that moment, I would love to have heard my explanation, because I have no idea what it would have been. But they didn't. So I leaned back into it, and the cord snapped, and I fell flat on my back on the cement, which stings, if you've ever done it. But the flag came fluttering down, and giggling like a maniac, of course, I took the flag and left with it Unfortunately, I was on foot, so that wasn't the smartest escape plan. But in those days, you could hitchhike, and Winnetka was kind of a main drag. So I had the flag. I actually was not trying to hide it. I actually had it wrapped around my shoulders um, because I had seen the Patti Smith group, I think, was the reason. No, I actually hadn't seen them yet at that point. But when I saw Patti Smith later on, she came out with an American flag draped around her shoulders. So on a different flag that I stole on the way to a party, I walked into the party with the flag draped around my shoulders. But this flag I was just carrying, went out to Winnetka, stuck my thumb out, got a ride from some hippie freak, and he's like, hey, wow, man, where you going? And I'm like, I'm just going up here, going home. You know, I just stole the flag from the Golden Valley Police Station. He's like, wow, that's cool. So, very supportive community among the hippie freaks in those days. Got a ride home, bragged to Dillinger about it, which just made us want to steal flags more. So then we stole some more flags, and then we got to this one house where we were able to get the flag lowered, but it was like a heavy duty cord, and we couldn't unhook the flag. We couldn't get the flag off the cord for whatever reason, because usually Dillinger had just whipped out his click knife and slashed the cord, but it was like a heavy duty cord, and we couldn't get it off. So, and we didn't want to stand there and try to be sawing at this cord. So I said to my pal, let's just light it on fire and run it back up the flagpole. And he thought that was a maniac idea. So of course we did it. We lit the sucker on fire. It immediately starts to torch up, it's bright as day. And we running it back up the flagpole, giggling, you know, like a couple of sociopathic morons, which we basically were. And I don't know why I'm laughing about this, but it is funny. I mean, ran it like most of the way back up the flagpole and did a quick loop around to hold it and ran off into the night. And I remember looking back, and there's the flag burning, and there was like a silhouette of a person in a window. And I think I might have had a momentary qualm of conscience when I did that, but that could just be me imagining it. Maybe I didn't. So stole a few more flags, and then at one point, you know, after we were done stealing flags, I got bored of it. When Dillinger first moved out and moved into his first apartment, actually I think he moved out because he was kicked out of his house by his legendary mom, and she was always kicking him out and then letting him back in throughout high school, but kicking various people out. She loved to assert her authority. This woman, by the way, during the gas crisis, when gas stations were putting up huge signs, no checks, and taking cash only, and people used to write checks in those days. There was no debit cards. And gas stations didn't take credit cards in those days. They took cash or checks mostly. So these gas stations used to put up signs that said no checks. And this woman was such a shrill, you know, verbally abusive type person that I remember riding with her in a car with Dillinger, and she said, let's get some gas. And she gets out her checkbook, and Dillinger says to his ma, he says, Ma, they don't take checks. There's a huge sign there that says no check. And she says, just pump the gas. They'll take a check. Filled her tank. She walked in, gave him the check. Guy started to tell her he's not going to take a check. She stood there and yelled at him and made him take it. He took the check just to get rid of her. That's the kind of person she was. She would return things. That's a 5-minute warning. She would return things to stores without receipts that she had bought at other stores. And they would give her her money back that she had spent at a different store with no receipt, completely contrary to the store's policy, just to get rid of her, just to shut her up, because she had that talent for people, which maybe is part of the reason why Dillinger was such a sociopath. He wasn't a sociopath. We were delinquents. That's all. I shouldn't exaggerate. But so, anyways, we burned that flag, and then. Years later, he got his apartment, and he didn't realize, apparently, that apartments don't come with curtains. So he had possession of most of our flags because I had never cared about keeping them, and so I had always given them away to various people or let him keep it. So he had enough American flags to put up flags as curtains. And the same week he did that, a police officer showed up at his door, because I'm sure there were some police officers who remembered that the Golden Valley police station flag had been stolen. So a police officer showed up at his door and knocked on the door and saw this, long-haired hippie freak. I was a punk rocker, I had short hair, and he had long hair, but we were blood brothers. Police officer shows up at his door and says, hey, kid, where'd you get all these flags? And good old Dillinger looked him straight in the eye and said, I just love America. And what's the cop going to say? I mean, they had no proof that they were stolen, but undoubtedly they had been receiving complaints over the years about stolen flags, and undoubtedly they suspected him, but they had no proof, so the cop just kind of shook his head and went away. So flash forward to a party, an LSD party. I was providing the LSD. I was big into LSD, which I think people are too hard on LSD. It doesn't actually cause flashbacks, and it doesn't actually make you hallucinate unless you take an overdose. I've probably taken LSD between, I'd say somewhere, I don't know how many times, but I'd say somewhere between 25 and 40 times, maybe a little higher than 40, I don't know. But never had a hallucination, never had a flashback. But so there was a time when we were tripping out at LSD with this guy who was slightly older than us, a couple of years older than us. He was like 20 or something. And we were at this point like, 18, 19, and he was maybe 21 or 22. I'll call this guy Doug, and that's not his name. But he had a party at his house, and we brought over the young people, and he had a few of his older friends there, but I provided the LSD, which was Blue Starship, blotter acid, some of the best acid you could get then or now. I mean, it was great stuff. And it was called Starship. This timer's about to go off, but I think I can finish this story. It was called Starship because the blotter sheet, if you bought 100 hits, had a picture stamped on it. It was blue blotter paper, baby blue. It had a picture stamped on the middle of the sheet of the Starship Enterprise. Little tiny picture on a much bigger sheet. So most of the hits didn't have any part of the picture, and they're all like little perforated squares if you haven't taken acid. And the hits that had a part of the picture still just had like a blue line running through them. So you couldn't see the Starship unless you saw the whole sheet of 100. But Blue Starship was the best. And we all tripped out on acid, or at least a whole bunch of us did. And we had fun, we're tripping out. And got to be about 5:30 in the morning or so, and the party's dwindling down to half a dozen people who are still, we're not peaking at this point on the acid, but we're still feeling the speedy effect, the after effect of being wide awake and alert, and we're still kind of up, and we're kind of, maintaining our edge by, a steady consumption of beers, which we've been consuming all night. Alcohol doesn't make you drunk when you're on acid. It doesn't matter how much you can drink. You can drink until you vomit, and you do not get drunk. The acid just overrides it. But we were still consuming the occasional beer and just altering our mood like crazy with beer and cigarettes and occasional hits of weed just to bring back a little bit of the high, just to freshen it up. And about 5:30 in the morning, there was half a dozen of us that were just sitting there, just chatting away, and we were sitting in this kitchen, and I think 3 or 4 of us had a game of gin. That's 25 minutes. 3 or 4 of us had a game of gin rummy going, and we got tired of the cards, and someone suggested to Doug, the older guy, that we take a walk, in the neighborhood, and just go out and stretch our legs. So me and Dillinger and Doug are out stretching our legs, and we're smoking cigarettes and just chatting away, and we're the best of friends. We're just had a great night. And for some reason, Dillinger mentioned something about stealing a flag, and then for some strange reason, we wound up telling him the story about burning this flag. And Dillinger said, he said something like, I feel kind of bad about it now. And Doug is listening to our story, and he says, what street were you on when you burned that flag? And we told him the street, and he starts laughing, And he says, "You sons of bitches, that was my house." And we all cracked up, laughing, and we all thought it was hilarious. And then when we were done laughing, he got serious for a minute, and he said to us, "You're just lucky that that wasn't the flag that my brother's body came back from Vietnam in, because I would have killed you motherfuckers." And we all busted out laughing again. And it was the strangest coincidence. But I have to say that even if I probably didn't have a qualm of conscience at the time, after that, knowing Doug, and he did mention how upset his mom and dad were, and I think he had a sister, but after getting to know the victim a little, it did make you think and think, yeah, I'm kind of glad we stopped doing that. So, anyways, that's the story about stealing flags and the acid party and the weird coincidence of getting to know that guy whose family we inadvertently, not inadvertently, but terrorized, and never dreamed that we would get to know a person from that family. So that's the whole story. And I'll post some more stories sometime soon. I'm going to turn this camera off now.